In the late 1930s, London stood as one of the most powerful and influential cities in the world. As the capital of the British Empire, it was a center of government, trade, finance, and culture. By 1939, more than 8 million people lived in the city, making it one of the largest urban populations in Europe. The streets of London were constantly busy, filled with double-decker buses, black taxis, bicycles, and pedestrians moving through crowded avenues and markets. Famous landmarks shaped the skyline of the city. St. Paul's Cathedral rose above the surrounding buildings, while the Houses of Parliament and the clock tower known as Big Ben stood along the River Thames. Tower Bridge opened and closed to allow ships to pass, and busy railway stations connected London to the rest of Britain. Markets, theaters, shops, and offices kept the city active day and night. Yet, while daily life continued, tensions across Europe were growing. Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, had already expanded its territory across the continent. Many people in Britain feared that another major war was approaching. Even so, in early 1939, much of London still appeared calm and normal. Few residents could fully imagine how dramatically their city would soon change once the Second World War reached Britain's capital. On September 3, 1939, Britain officially declared war on Germany after the German invasion of Poland. Within hours, the news spread across London through radio broadcasts, newspapers, and public announcements. Although the war had begun on the European continent, British leaders knew it was only a matter of time before the conflict reached the skies above their capital. The British government quickly began preparing London for the possibility of air attacks. Military planners believed that German bombers could target major cities, and London, with its large population, industries, ports, and government buildings, was considered one of the most likely targets. One of the first major changes introduced was the nationwide blackout. At night, all visible lights had to be covered or turned off so enemy aircraft could not easily locate cities from the air. Street lights were switched off, shop windows were darkened, and households covered their windows with thick curtains or painted glass. Air raid sirens were installed throughout the city to warn civilians of incoming attacks. When the sirens sounded, residents were expected to immediately seek shelter. To prepare for this, thousands of public air raid shelters were built across London. The most common were Anderson shelters, which were small steel structures placed in gardens, and large communal shelters constructed in public spaces. The government also distributed gas masks to millions of civilians, fearing that chemical weapons might be used during bombing raids. Children were taught how to wear them, and many adults carried them wherever they went. Although London had not yet been heavily bombed, the city was already transforming into a wartime capital, preparing for a threat that many feared was inevitable. One of the most noticeable changes in wartime London was the complete blackout that took effect soon after the war began. The British government ordered strict blackout regulations to prevent German bombers from easily identifying cities at night. If enemy pilots could see lights from above, they could use them to locate streets, factories, railways, and important landmarks. To prevent this, London became almost completely dark after sunset. Streetlights were turned off across the city, and homes were required to cover their windows with thick curtains or blackout blinds. Even the smallest beam of light escaping into the street could result in fines. Shop owners, offices, and factories also had to follow these rules, carefully sealing any visible light. Cars were still allowed to operate at night, but their headlights were heavily restricted. Drivers used special covers that allowed only a narrow beam of light to shine onto the road. As a result, driving became slow and difficult, and accidents became more common. The darkened streets created a strange and unfamiliar atmosphere across the city. Areas that had once been brightly lit and crowded with nightlife now appeared silent and shadowy after dusk. For many residents, moving through London at night became challenging and sometimes dangerous. To help enforce the blackout rules, air raid precautions wardens patrolled neighborhoods. Their job was to make sure residents followed regulations and to guide people to safety during air raids. If a window was showing light, wardens would knock on the door and order it to be covered immediately. Although inconvenient and sometimes frightening, the blackout became an essential part of London's defense during the war. The large-scale bombing of London began on the evening of September 7, 1940, marking the start of what would become known as the Blitz. On that day, hundreds of German aircraft crossed the English Channel and headed toward the British capital. Their primary target was the Docklands area in East London, where many of the city's warehouses, factories, and shipping facilities were located. As the bombers approached, air raid sirens sounded across the city, warning residents to seek shelter. Soon after, the first bombs began to fall. High explosive bombs destroyed buildings and roads, while incendiary bombs were designed to start massive fires across the city. Within hours, large parts of the Docklands were burning, and thick smoke covered the skyline. The attacks did not stop after that first night. For 57 consecutive nights, German bombers returned to London. The raids usually began in the evening and continued through the night, forcing millions of residents to take shelter underground or inside air raid shelters. During these attacks, the sky above London was filled with searchlights, anti-aircraft fire, and the distant sound of aircraft engines. Explosions echoed through neighborhoods as bombs struck homes, factories, and public buildings. Fires sometimes burned for hours, and firefighters worked through the night trying to control them. Entire districts suffered heavy damage, and thousands of buildings were destroyed. Civilians faced constant danger as bombs fell unpredictably across the city. Despite the destruction, London continued to function. Public services kept operating, and many residents returned to work the next morning even after long nights spent in shelters. The Blitz became one of the most intense bombing campaigns ever experienced by a major city. As the bombing of London intensified during the Blitz, thousands of civilians searched for safer places to spend the night. One of the most important refuges became the London Underground, the city's subway system. Many of its stations were built deep beneath the streets, making them far safer than buildings above ground during air raids. At first, the government was hesitant to allow people to shelter in the underground stations. Officials worried that large crowds could interfere with transportation or create panic. However, as the bombing grew more severe, thousands of Londoners began entering the stations each night, seeking protection from the explosions above. Eventually, authorities accepted the situation and organized the shelters more formally. Every evening, long lines of people carrying blankets, pillows, and small bags of personal belongings would gather outside station entrances. When the air raid sirens sounded, they moved down the stairs and escalators into the tunnels below. The platforms quickly filled with families, workers, and children preparing to spend the night underground. Conditions were often crowded, but many people tried to make the best of the situation. Some families brought folding beds or mattresses, while others simply slept on the platform floor. Volunteers and shelter staff helped distribute tea, food, and basic medical assistance. Despite the fear and uncertainty, a sense of community often developed in these shelters. People talked, played cards, read newspapers, and sometimes musicians performed to lift morale. While bombs fell above the city, life continued in the underground tunnels where thousands waited for morning and the signal that it was safe to return to the streets of London. As the bombing raids continued through 1940 and 1941, large parts of London were transformed into scenes of destruction. Entire streets that once held rows of houses, shops, and offices were reduced to piles of broken bricks, twisted metal, and shattered glass. Bomb craters appeared in roads, and many buildings were left partially collapsed or completely destroyed. High explosive bombs caused the greatest damage, tearing apart buildings and sending debris across surrounding streets. Incendiary bombs created another major threat. These smaller bombs were designed to start fires, and when thousands of them fell across the city, entire neighborhoods could quickly ignite. Firefighters worked constantly to control these blazes, often battling flames for hours while more bombs continued to fall. Many residential areas suffered heavy losses. Families sometimes returned from shelters in the morning to find their homes severely damaged or completely gone. In some districts, whole blocks of buildings had disappeared overnight. Despite the destruction, daily life did not stop entirely. Buses continued to move through damaged streets, sometimes passing piles of rubble and broken buildings. Shop owners reopened stores even if their windows had been blown out or their buildings partially damaged. Workers continued traveling to factories, offices, and docks that were still operating. One of the most famous images from the Blitz showed St. Paul's Cathedral standing tall while smoke and fire surrounded the city. The survival of the cathedral became a powerful symbol of London's resilience. Although the streets of London were scarred by war, The city continued to function, and its people continued to endure the constant threat of bombing. During the Blitz, thousands of people worked every day and night to protect civilians and respond to the damage caused by bombing raids. These groups formed part of Britain's civil defense system, which was organized to help cities survive constant air attacks. One of the most visible groups were the Air Raid Precautions, ARP wardens. They patrolled neighborhoods during blackouts and air raids, helping enforce safety rules and guiding people to nearby shelters when sirens sounded. Wardens also checked buildings for damage after attacks and reported fires, unexploded bombs, or injured civilians. Firefighters played an especially critical role during the bombing campaigns. Incendiary bombs frequently caused large fires across the city, sometimes spreading quickly through residential neighborhoods or industrial areas. Fire brigades worked through the night, using hoses, pumps, and water from the River Thames to control the flames. In some cases, firefighters had to continue working even while bombs were still falling nearby. Rescue teams were responsible for searching damaged buildings and saving people trapped under rubble. After an explosion collapsed a house or apartment building, rescue workers carefully dug through debris to find survivors. This work was dangerous, as damaged structures could collapse at any moment. Medical teams and volunteers also helped the injured. Temporary first aid posts were set up across the city, where doctors and nurses treated civilians hurt during the raids. Together, these civil defense workers helped London survive some of the most intense bombing attacks of the war. Their efforts saved countless lives and helped restore order in the city after each devastating air raid. Even while bombing raids continued, everyday life in London did not completely stop. Millions of people still needed to work, travel, and maintain daily routines despite the constant threat of air attacks. The city had to adapt quickly to the conditions of wartime. One major change was the introduction of food rationing. Because supplies were limited and shipping routes were threatened by German submarines, the British government carefully controlled the distribution of food. Items such as meat, butter, sugar, and eggs could only be purchased in limited amounts using ration books. Long queues often formed outside shops as people waited their turn to buy essential supplies. Another major wartime policy involved the evacuation of children. To protect them from bombing, hundreds of thousands of children were moved from London and other major cities to safer areas in the countryside. Many traveled by train with teachers and volunteers, staying with host families far from the danger of air raids. Posters and public announcements also played an important role in maintaining morale. Messages encouraging calmness, cooperation, and determination appeared throughout the city. Slogans such as "Keep calm and carry on" reflected the government's effort to keep the population focused and resilient. Despite the destruction around them, many Londoners continued their normal routines as much as possible. Workers went to factories, buses and trains kept running, and schools and offices reopened whenever conditions allowed. Life in wartime London was filled with uncertainty and hardship, but the city's residents showed remarkable determination to continue living and working even during one of the most difficult periods in their history. By the spring of 1941, the long period of continuous bombing known as the Blitz began to slow. For months, London had endured repeated night raids that caused widespread destruction and heavy civilian casualties. However, changes in Germany's military strategy gradually reduced the number of large air attacks against the British capital. One of the most destructive raids occurred on the night of May 10, 1941, when hundreds of German bombers once again attacked London. During this raid, large areas of the city were heavily damaged, and several important buildings were hit. Fires burned across multiple districts, and thousands of homes were destroyed. It became one of the final major bombing raids of the Blitz. Soon after this attack, Germany began shifting its military focus toward the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, which would begin the following month. As a result, the large-scale bombing campaign against London decreased significantly. By the end of the Blitz, the damage across Britain had been severe. More than 40,000 civilians had been killed, and many more were injured. In London alone, hundreds of thousands of homes had been damaged or destroyed. Entire neighborhoods had been changed by months of bombing. Despite these losses, the city had not collapsed. Government services continued to operate, transportation systems kept running, and many businesses reopened even in damaged districts. The survival of London during the Blitz became an important symbol for Britain during the war. The city had endured months of intense attacks but continued to function, demonstrating the resilience of its people and institutions.